This year, as you've heard, our theme is the mysteries of light. And in addition to what Frank brought up, I also want to mention some upcoming conferences that I think play nicely into what we're doing. And after this conference, the foundations of the mysteries of light should enable you to get even more out of these. One is the Anthroposophical Society in America that Frank mentioned, and the other is Gopi's conference, A Renewal of Science, October 31st to November 2nd at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. So I hope we can attend at least one of those two conferences. As a wannabe scientist, I am taking on the role tonight to bring us all up to speed on quantum mechanics. I know, I'm attempting to do the impossible to make quantum mechanics understandable. To help me get us started on this arduous journey, I thought we should learn a little song I first heard at Hope Church in Amherst, Massachusetts. Goes like this. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Okay, so now you all know why I'm infamous for my singing disability. What is this little light of mine? I think this is from very esoteric roots, actually. And with our focus on the mysteries of light, this conference dares to begin to answer such questions. Together, we will explore what is light, both outer and inner light, and then attempt to find if these are related. We will dabble in various views from all of the sciences, including spiritual science. I find this theme to be very exciting. And why do I find this so exciting? Because, as we will hear, science is at the threshold. Matter has been shown by science to be a kind of illusion. I'll talk about that. And even more so, science has encountered consciousness. Those seeking meaning in life, those spiritual seekers, now have common ground with scientists. While ideas now intersect, the language or the concepts in each still keep us separated. But this is a remarkable moment when science, arts, and religion can be brought back together again. May this, our 8th annual conference, carry this hope within our hearts as we proceed. Last year, we studied resonance with a focus on cymatics in the field of sound. We held our hybrid conference, that means simultaneously online and live, at the wonderful auditorium of Pine Hill at High Mowing Waldorf School in Wilton, New Hampshire. We found that sound can make forms. We learned that movement precedes form. This year, we ask, is there something similar in the field of optics or of light? Last month, I attended a water conference put on by the natural science section of the School for Spiritual Science. One speaker, Judith Erb, who will speak tomorrow night, led us into the chemistry of water. We find there is nothing wet about hydrogen or oxygen on their own. There isn't even anything wet about a single water molecule. But put lots of them together in the right conditions, and you will get wet. This wetness of water is what's called an emergent property, a phenomenon that can't be explained by the fundamental property of something's constituent parts. Rather, it manifests only when those parts are extremely numerous and act together like an organism. Emergent phenomena are ubiquitous in nature, and they point to something more than materialism. Let me give you an overview now of this year's conference. We will explore positions taken by natural science and spiritual science. As we journey together, our speakers may add some of their own insights or even some of their own speculations. We hope to ignite a fire, not so much with answers, but with our questions. Questions such as, what really is light? What is outer light? What is inner light? Are these related? How does light behave in space and time and in the human being? Can the mysteries of light reveal the relationship of light to consciousness? I'd like now to draw our attention, especially on this last subject, to the magnificent work of Professor Arthur Zients, who was at one time the General Secretary of the Anthroposophical Society in America, while at the same time was a professor of physics at Amherst College, one of the top colleges in the United States of America. His research and anthroposophical work was inspired by University of Michigan professor Ernst Katz, who introduced Arthur to anthroposophy. Arthur received from Michigan his BS in 71, MS in 73, and PhD in 76. Then he was a physics professor at Amherst College until his retirement in 2015. But Arthur also served as president or co-founder of various institutions, including the Lindisfarne Association, the Mind and Life Institute, the Kira Institute, and the Fetzer Institute. Plus, Arthur and his wife, Kitty, wow, helped to found a thriving Waldorf school in the Amherst area. Arthur teamed up with the Dalai Lama for several summits, such as in 2002, called The Nature of Matter, the Nature of Life. And then in later that year, the New Physics and Cosmology, Dialogues with the Dalai Lama. And then at MIT in 2003, Investigating the Mind. But perhaps Arthur will best be known in the years ahead by this book, Catching the Light, The Entwined History of Light and Mind. Light and consciousness was a central theme to Arthur's work. This is truly a significant book for our times. In addition to Catching the Light, Arthur published many papers and articles about light and consciousness, or about science and spirituality. Before Arthur came on the scene, science had held as given, there is no reality except for material reality. Matter is unconscious. Evolution is purposeless, and consciousness is merely physical activity in the brain. Now, and since the second half of the last century, after science had realized that it had encountered consciousness, it must account for this when it conducts experiments, especially in the quantum area, and in determining results. I'll talk more about this. There are now quite a number of scientists expressing views that extend the prior boundaries of science.
I had to clear this up with Jordy.
Okay, Frank? Okay. These numbers of scientists are growing. One pioneer I greatly admire is Rupert Sheldrake. Sheldrake participated in a debate in 2023, at Bergen University in Sweden on the subject, does consciousness extend beyond brains? The recording of this debate has already exceeded 2 million views. So you can see this is a question out there. It's a very important question. And Rupert has been asking other profound questions, such as about fields, such as magnetic and gravitational fields, asking, are these formal or formative causes? Rupert has long thought that morphic fields act as formative causes, which is the basis of his hypothesis of morphic resonance. Oh my, doesn't that sound just a bit like anthroposophy's etheric fields and formative forces? We had hoped to have Rupert here as a speaker, along with Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, but unfortunately, neither could arrange to be here at the time we asked them. Okay, let's begin our journey. With our physical senses, we experience what physics calls the macro world. Here, our physical senses reveal this world to us. Underneath this is the micro world of molecules. Here, with the help of microscopes, we come to understand molecules. And with further instruments, we found molecules were composed of the elements of the periodic chart, namely atoms. And we went further with more sophisticated instruments to detect what we call quantum level of subatomic particles. Now, in 1905, science was questioning its view that atoms were, in fact, inelastic balls. Protons would not be discovered until 1917, and neutrons not until 1932, when the model of the atom was finally accepted. That is, accepted up to our times. In 1905, Rudolf Steiner was alive, and he was offering his own views, such as, imagine it would be possible to make an atom grow bigger and bigger. So he wants you to picture this. Just take this picture of an atom and grow it large until it was as big as the Earth. One would then discover a very complicated world. That wasn't anything like other scientists at that time were thinking, but he was right. Going on with Steiner, one would perceive many movements, different kinds of phenomena within this tiny thing we call an atom. What makes up an atom is almost entirely empty space. Look at a molecule. The empty space is so prominent that it is a wonder we don't walk through walls. We ask, why doesn't light go through walls? Particles, such as neutrinos, certainly do. But with waves, size matters. 4G Wi-Fi could go through walls, but 5G Wi-Fi cannot, because the wavelengths are different. And visible light and higher frequencies also cannot. Here, science is so close to understand the statement that the material world is Maya, illusion. Many scientists respond that there is no absolute vacuum. We can call it empty space, perhaps, but there is something there in this empty space they call fields, non-material fields. Okay, so then what is a field? A quick comment while exploring this subatomic world, we are in a realm that cannot be seen, like the etheric. Even with the best instrumentation, neither the Higgs boson nor the top quark can be observed directly since they are unstable and disintegrate or decay nearly instantly into other particles. It is only indirectly by observing the particles emerging out of their decays, or what we think are particles, because of their effect on the environment around them, that we can claim we've discovered the Higgs boson or the top quark. But by indirectly, we are relying on theory to interpret the experimental results and even for the setup of the experiment itself. Originally, I took some 25 minutes to explain what I'm going to have this scientist do in just 9 minutes.
So let's start with how quantum mechanics evolved. In 1801, British physicist Thomas Young performed a simple double-slit experiment, which showed that light was a wave, because it formed an interference pattern as a wave would. So for most of the 19th century, light was considered a wave. However, in 1887, German physicist Heinrich Hertz discovered something called the photoelectric effect. This is a phenomenon where light can knock off electrons from atoms. But it was found this phenomenon was not triggered by certain colors, regardless of the intensity of the light, but only by higher frequencies of the light. So ultraviolet rays resulted in this effect, but light at the red end of the spectrum did not, no matter how bright you made it. This was not the way a classical wave was supposed to behave. This mystery was solved by none other than Albert Einstein, who proposed that light was not a wave, but came in packets of energy, or particles. You know them as photons. These were packets of waves, he said, and the energy of these particles was proportional to the frequency of the wave. So higher frequency light corresponding to the blue and violet end of the visible scale carried more energy than lower frequency light corresponding to the red end of the spectrum. By the way, Einstein won the Nobel Prize for this. He did not win it for relativity. So Young and Einstein's results seemed to be in conflict. Was light a wave or a particle? But then, in 1909, G.I. Taylor performed a double-slit experiment such that only one photon was emitted through the double slits at a time. So what was seen on the screen? Well, if you shine a single photon through a double slit, you will see a single point on the other side. No mystery there. But then, as more and more photons are shot one at a time through the slits, and if you do this millions of times, a pattern emerges that looks like the same interference pattern that Young had demonstrated more than 100 years earlier. So individual photons look like particles, but a bunch of photons behave together like a wave. So photons appear to be both a wave and a particle. This was confusing. This experiment was later performed with electrons, which also showed the same pattern. But people were perplexed as to what a wave of an electron actually means. We can understand water waves because we can see them. They oscillate up and down. But what is actually happening with an electron? This was a mystery. In classical mechanics, Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, makes a mathematical prediction regarding the path a physical object will take. If you know its initial conditions, you can always figure out where the object will be. Something that showed a similar mathematical description of the wave of electrons was needed. Something that showed the location of the electron or the shape of its wave function. In 1925, Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger invented the Nobel Prize-winning equation that revealed the shape of this wave function. It was the quantum mechanical equivalent of Newton's law, and it's probably the most important equation in quantum mechanics. We're not going to derive this formula, but I just want you to understand one thing about it. Unlike Newton's equation, it is not deterministic. It is not straightforward like Newton's equations. It evolves over time. The psi in the equation, which looks like a trident, is a wave function. Psi gives us the shape of the wave as a function of x. Schrödinger himself struggled with the interpretation of this wave function. That is, what does it actually mean? His interpretation was that it was the charge density of the electron over space. But this was actually not correct, and it did not work. In 1926, German physicist Max Born worked out that the psi function was related to probability. He said it represented the probability of finding the electron in any one point in space. So, for example, this equation describes the behavior of electrons in an atom. It shows how the electrons occupy certain orbitals and what their shapes are. These shapes are really the probability densities of finding the electron in any particular spot.
Okay, so let me come back to our, and you can hear in this physicist's explanation this question of, is it a wave or is it a particle? And throughout this 20th century, that battle went on and on. And then what you just heard was this coming to the realization that for quantum physicists, the answer is it's got to be both. But does the way that we test have anything to do with the results that we get? Here is one of those books that this speaker cites, and there are many others, as we'll soon see, by peering deeper into the matter, from bodies to molecules to atoms to subatomic particles, our macro world disappears. At this level, physicists say the observer or the observation itself affects the outcome. And this led David Chalmers to declare in 1995 that science had to face the hard problem of consciousness. Physics had encountered consciousness. Boy. Quantum physics says a superposition of states exists. That means that it has a probability of a number of possible places to be. And so they call it a superposition. And then this collapses to a definite state upon observation or measurement. This collapse of the wave function is something that is very important to quantum physics today. And I'd say every scientist today accepts that that happens. When you observe, when you measure, that's when the wave function collapses and it no longer looks like a wave, it looks like a particle. Now, this book, Quantum Enigma, was first published in 2008. So I'm trying to give you a time frame for when this great change in physics occurred. There's been several other books by physicists were also published about this time, citing very similar ideas. The conclusion of quantum physics was already suggested by Rudolf Steiner more than a dozen years earlier. So here is Rudolf Steiner from the 3rd of December, 1912. In science, we pay attention only to what actually happens, not to what may be continually happening. The range of such possibilities is infinitely greater than that of actual happenings. All these possibilities, which do not become reality on the physical plane, exist as forces and effects behind the physical world, in the spiritual world, and reverberate through it. It is not only the forces which actually determine our life on the physical plane that stream down upon us, but also the measureless abundance of forces which remain only as possibilities. Boy, that sounds like quantum mechanics long before it ever came into existence. The speaker's main point in that video that we saw was that measuring by an instrument is different from the observation by a conscious being. But he did not mention the effect caused by the measurement tool. It is consequential. How do we see what we're looking at? We could not call the measuring tool conscious, but to detect a photon, the method of seeing it has affected the object itself. It would not be until 2013 that a group at Max Planck Institute therefore built the first detector that did not need to absorb the photon in order to detect it. Rather, it reflected the photon to keep it alive. But although the photon was not absorbed, its superposition phase was collapsed. The idea of light, ideas of it go back well into ancient Greek times and further. Until the 17th century, light was thought of as a wave. Newton changed this with his corpuscular theory, making light into particles, and it stayed that way until the 19th century, when light was once again proven to be a wave. Scientists then asked, what could be its medium? And for a while, a materialistic view of the etheric realm ensued. As the 20th century began, much confusion reigned. We'll hear even Rudolf Steiner injecting his thoughts into this debate. The 1927 Copenhagen Conference concluded, as we have been hearing, that light is both a wave and a particle. Now, statistics came to solve their conundrum. Physics concluded that the photon was a quanta of energy. Before being measured, its location was everywhere within its probability function. Statistics. Measurement collapsed this probability function by finding a particle at a particular location. So it was said light was a wave until measured, and then became a particle, a photon. I will ask us to consider that as etheric light penetrates matter, it enters the physical. It thus changes from being a wave to being physical light. And then when we observe a particle, have we robbed sunlight of some of its divine properties when we place it into the electromagnetic spectrum? I question whether the use of lasers for studies of light is biasing the possible results. Can we say all light sources are the same? I claim laser light is different from sunlight. And to help me make this, I should mention Plato right now. In his book, Timaeus, Plato says, we humans have etheric light within us that streams out through our eyes. This is the completion of perception into seeing. Perception into seeing. Our etheric light mingles with the object's etheric light in the moment of comprehension. And with this, Rudolf Steiner agrees. In GA 231, when discussing our experience of what we observe on the Earth's surface, he says, for our eyes to see, they must forget themselves completely. At this moment, it seems as though our very eyes are sending out streams of light that penetrate, and he's holding this quartz crystal. At the same moment, something comes to life in us that causes us to feel united with the whole. In lesson 12 of the first class, Steiner also mentions the radiance of not just our eyes, but all of our senses. I should add the work of Rupert Sheldrake again at this point, for he has demonstrated that people can be aware of being stared at. It is my experience that wild animals, especially birds, also have this ability. For when I stare at them through my office window, they certainly do seem to become aware of my gazing. If true, then this gazing of the observer is sending etheric light into what is being observed, and this light must affect the object. And I should also mention here the work of Robert Grosseteste, who wrote De Luce, meaning the light. He says, light becomes the first substance before corporeity. Steiner points out that the Rosicrucians took this seriously and discovered its truth. I'll say more about this later. This, before its physical substance, is observed out of the morality of one's soul. So Grosseteste states that light condenses into the four earthy elements. It also radiates via rarefication into all 9 levels of the heavenly hierarchy. Matter, he says, is spent light. And I've just discovered a group of scientists saying that light, or I should say matter, is frozen light. So we have here in the 12th century, matter is spent light, and today matter is frozen light. Since the 15th century, science has tried to say that light is only an attribute of the physical. According to Rudolf Steiner, light is essentially an attribute of the spiritual. But we can't say that if we're scientists. Herein lies a potential bridge, though, from science today to spiritual science. Steiner adds, while we are incarnated on the physical plane, we can glow with the light of our thinking, albeit very weakly. Light gradually becomes what is spiritual in us. In the human aura, the clairvoyant can see our thinking as light. When during evolution did light begin? Genesis describes a beginning without light. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. This love-filled darkness was called Old Saturn. It was the first cosmic state. What became of Saturn's warmth? It provides the basis for the next planetary condition. Just as modern astrophysics field of metallicity does, Steiner's esoteric science book describes 3 prior solar systems or planetary conditions to our Earth existence of today. The beings of old Saturn, who were at the human stage back then, are today's archai. Don't imagine this human stage as anything like the stage of today, for nothing physical existed then. Let there be light. The next solar system, called Old Sun, expanded the warmth, the love, into an above and a below, that is, into ether light and into the substance air. These two, light and air, are thus intimately related. Please do not confuse this air with what we call air today, for it was not yet physical. The third solar system, Old Moon, water below, the chemical ether above, were added to creation. Of course, the prior conditions of warmth, air, and light continue. from the beginning of Old Moon, time as we know it existed. And we can say it found its birth when in Old Sun, this wisdom was radiated out from the center, and the beings on the human stage of Old Sun gathered it up, so to speak, and radiated it back as light. So there was a bit of a before and after. That was the birth of time. Now, and in my next talk later in this conference on Saturday, I will take up light in time and space. So here's a short commentary by Rudolf Steiner to help us understand that diagram. Think of a sphere, okay? So we think of the sphere. Picture something being radiated from the center out to the periphery, and from there, something radiates back to the center. On the inside surface of this sphere is the human stage I mentioned, and it was populated by what are today the archangels. They radiate back what came from the center. You don't need to imagine anything on the outside of the sphere. It's outside of existence. What radiates from the spirits of wisdom in the center is caught by the archangels and radiated back. What is that which radiates back into space within the sphere? The wisdom of the Kyriates is radiated back, and that is light. Thus, it is the archangels who are the creators of light. The spirits of wisdom have their inner being reflected back to them as light from an outer being with a time delay. In this way, space comes into being, although not yet in 3 dimensions as we're accustomed to, but 2-dimensionally as inner and outer. Thus, space is born from time. Space and time are not independent of each other. Light and air belong together. Light is an active organizing force in the whole airy organism. Here we come into the realm of soul. There is not only external light, but also metamorphosed inner light, which permeates the whole human being which lives in us. The light lives within us together with the air. So back to our diagram. Now something else existed from the start of Old Moon. There was an important spiritual impulse from the Godhead that directed some of those beings who were administrators for the moon, called the dynamis, or spirits of movement, to also become beings of hindrance. Now we come to the 4th planetary condition we call Earth. So everything is continuing from before. Here, what was warmth on old Saturn has become the solid Earth below, and above now the life ether. Very importantly, space in 3D began with Earth. And what were those spirits of hindrances when they come to Earth? They have given birth to what we might say is evil. We might ask, do the mysteries of light have anything to do with this evil? When Earth evolution has been completed, there will be a cosmic pause called a pralaya, and then will begin the next planetary condition called Jupiter. To those on the human stage of Jupiter, we will be to them what our guardian angel is to us now. Think about that. You've got to become a guardian angel to those who will be on the human stage of Jupiter. We have a lot to grow. Time, as we know it, comes about during the moon existence and 3D space during Earth existence. We cannot speak of Saturn, Sun, and Moon and use any spatial concepts. For 3D space only has meaning for that which evolves within the span of Earth evolution. For our development, space and time are our boundaries. Steiner. Each of our three planetary conditions were recapitulated during Earth evolution. Thus, in the beginning of Earth, there was just a nebula of warmth. This epoch is called Polaris. The next epoch, called Hyperborea, recapitulates Old Sun. During this epoch, the nebula divided, and certain beings left the nebula that has become the planets and Earth to form the sun. So now we understand, let there be light. With the addition of light, Lucifer was given access to the human. This bearer of light succeeded in incorporating into us the ability to know good and evil, or the desire to know. For this, we had to change our bodily constitution into one wherein we felt separated from all other beings, including spiritual beings. We had to fall into a new realm that required the help of Ahriman to build this Maya that we live in of the physical world. There was still no solidity yet on Earth or to our bodies until the middle of the Atlantean epoch. Rudolf Steiner claims both air and light themselves have changed inwardly during earthly evolution. We live in an atmosphere, in a light sphere, that are different from those in which our souls lived in previous earthly incarnations. And our current conditions are now preparing for what will be upon the next, the fifth solar system, called Jupiter. With each step in evolution, what had already come into existence is, in essence, retained. For example, the sun and earth were once one cosmic body. The light from that epoch provides the basis from what we have today on earth as electricity. We have electricity as a force, which is sun force, long connected with the earth, but a hidden sun force in the earth. Electric light is actually light retained in the earth from old sun. Steiner offers no further explanation in this lecture as to how this came about. And I'm referring to the lecture from GA 194, the 30th of November 1919, called The Mission of the Archangel Michael. But here is what is given high school students as to how light comes about. If an electron is orbiting its nucleus at some given orbit, and the next lower orbit can accommodate more electrons, then if it drops into that lower orbit, it can release a quanta of now excess energy, which we call a photon. Mathematically, this works even when we call this photon a particle, and we call the electron a particle, because there was a quanta of energy released. But it does not tell us what a photon actually is. Commonly, it just said quanta of energy, and hence the name quantum physics. There are several misunderstandings of light, and here is one: that the photon emitted when an electron jumped closer to its nucleus is supposed to be a particle. As this light streams away from its source, there must be a proton at every point in the circumference of the sphere of the light source. Now picture, this sphere is expanding, and at every point, there, all the way around the sphere, there's a photon. As light radiates out, this sphere of light is expanding. But there is a photon still at every point of every sphere, behind it and in front of it. When the sphere has expanded to have a diameter of billions of kilometers, there is still a photon at every point in the circumference. and at every point in every ray. In actuality, as physics understands this today, this expanding sphere travels outward at the speed of light as a wave. It only collapses into a particle, photon, when it is measured or observed by something physical. So we heard in this video the dual slit experiment. And on the top, you see if we had just a single slit, we would get something that looks like this. But with the double slit, we get something that looks like the bottom picture, which proved that it has to be waves. And why is that? You can see on the left that waves can add together, or if they're in phase together, or they can cancel each other. So that on the screen, what you see on the right, you see darker areas where they canceled each other and bright areas where they lined up their peaks of their waves. And as he said in that video, okay, we can do it with photons, but what about electrons? And amazingly, it still worked with electrons. But this raises a horribly difficult problem. With photons, we can say photons have no mass, and therefore photons can travel at the speed of light. But electrons have mass. And so electrons must have to travel slower than the speed of light. How do we know what's going on? Normally, we shine a light upon it to see it, but doing so will change the properties of what we observe at this quantum level. You know, it's sort of like if somebody needed to see me by using drops of water, let's say, then you know, how the water bounced off of my head might tell them something about what I look like. But if I'm such a tiny thing that the drop of water, when it hits me, knocks me over, you know, that's how you have to picture what's going on here. So the mere presence of an observer causes changes in the interference pattern of the electron waves. So they set this up for the electron to even go through the dual slit. And it showed that even going through the dual slit, it looks like waves. I'm sorry. So all of this, these guys and women had to face when they met in 1927 to form what is called the Copenhagen interpretation. And yes, this is enhanced by AI. And interestingly, just to point out, you can see in the front the older scientists, and then we get younger ones as we go backwards. So I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, light is both wave and particle. Is it one thing in the etheric realm and another on the physical plane? Light invisibly floods through space. Every physical thing that we perceive in space receives and reflects light. Only by reflection can we perceive individual objects. So important to understand this. We see only that which reflects light. We don't see light. Our eyes receives these reflected rays. Light interacting with matter produces colors. The rainbow, mentioned after the Great Flood, is this spiritual sunlight penetrating into matter. We see in the video how red and blue light differ when they penetrate into matter. When sunlight meets and penetrates matter, is red light carrying warmth into matter while blue light is carrying chemical? So plant with photosynthesis is enabled by sunlight to be a living chemist. The chloroplast is somehow able to transfer energy from light to the right location for further processing with something like a 97% efficiency. Just compare that to solar panels that are at best 20% efficient. When we burn wood, does the fire's light come from the release of sunlight captured in the wood by this photosynthesis? And what Rudolf Steiner offered concerning light is tantalizingly close to where quantum physics has reached today. Let's hear part of this view of Steiner's. He said, man lives through his physical body in perception and through his etheric body in thought. We perceive external light. One has a certain experience in connection with external light. One has the same experience in imagination, in connection with the thought element of the head. Thus, the thought element viewed objectively is experienced as light. Being thinking people, we live in light. We see the external light with physical senses. But the light which becomes thought, we do not see because we live in it. Because as thinking beings, it is the same in ourselves. We cannot see that which one is themselves. Hope that makes sense. If you emerge from this thought and enter upon imagination and inspiration, you put yourself opposite to it and then can see the thought element as light. So we can only see this light when we attain to this level of imagination, or even more so when we attain to inspiration, capital I in both cases. So that in speaking of the whole world, we may say, we have the light in us, only it does not appear to us as light because we live in it. And because while we use the light, while we have it, it becomes thought within us. You control the light, as it were. You take up the light in yourself, which otherwise appears outside you. You differentiate it in yourself. You work in it. It is precisely your thinking. It is a working in light. You are a light being. You do not know it because you live within the light. And your thinking, which you unfold, is living in the light. And if you look at thought from the outside, you see it as light. Thus, as cosmic beings think, their higher thinking is for us light. Well, what does natural science say about sunlight? Well, they first say the sun is a ball of gas. And every second, 700 million tons of hydrogen is being converted into almost that amount of helium. Energy is released first as gamma rays that then become sunlight. And there's no oxygen involved, so no fire is involved, but it sure is hot. The sun fills space and goes through standard stellar evolution. The purest appearance of the outer physical body of the Logos is the light of the sun. Sunlight is not only material light. To spiritual perception, it is also the garment of the Logos. In sunlight, spirit streams to the earth, the spirit of love. Together with physical sunlight, there streams the warm love of the Godhead for the earth. The interior of the sun is not a ball of gas. It is rather negative space, counter space. Oh, I wish we had more time to properly go into all of this, but we need to stick to light. What I just was reading from is G.A. 214, the 22nd of August, 1922. Before I read to you this quote, let me tell you that Rudolf Steiner spoke about how through the senses we breathe in the four ethers, and he called this refined breathing and distinguished it from the breathing of air. Here's the quote. Now we know that with each sun ray shining down upon us during the day, spirit is also entering us. Through every sense experience, spirit is entering us. We have therefore to regard the higher, finer breathing of the ethers through our senses as a breathing, and that this is continuously impregnated by spirit. And we perceive that the sun is living in every sense perception that streams into us. It is indeed the spirit of the sun, or the spirits of the sun. The sun is present in every sense perception. In our refined breathing, the sun force, the light, the sun life is streaming straight into us. So you see the relation humanity has to the sun. When a ray of light streams into your eye, the sun spirit is streaming in with that ray of light. The spirit of the sun is the substance of this refined breathing. With our sense perceptions, we breathe in the manifold ingredients of the spirit sun. In ancient times, the sun was seen as our moral source. Today, the sun is pictured as a globe of burning gas, as you heard, that radiates somehow light into the universe. Those people of ancient times claimed the sun was a living being, its light as the outward manifestation of this spirit being. All the stars, too, were seen as the home of spirit beings. This age, which came to an end long before the time of the mystery of Golgotha, but now has come the time to rediscover this. Physical light is but the external body of the astral light which radiates the sun. What does that which plays around the plant desire? It desires to absorb the soul of the sunbeam, and with the soul, its purest part, its eye. And it is this purest part which passes through the plant to the center of the earth. The activity of the plant's ego is expressed in the activity of the spiritual content of that sunbeam, which passes through it to the center of the earth. Thus, earth, plant, and sun work together. In our life by day, or also by night, for then there is electric light now, the sun, the light of the sun, illumines the objects around us. The sunlight makes them visible. In a similar way, the other senses become aware of surrounding objects. Now, directly after the threshold is crossed, we must become one with the light of our inmost being. The light cannot enable us to see objects because on the other side of the threshold, we have to pass into the very light itself. Objects can be seen with the help of the light only as long as the light is outside. When we are moving in the light itself, then for the first time we become aware that thinking is in reality one with the light weaving in the world. Thinking that is bound up with the body is proper to physical life only. Whenever we leave this body at death, our thinking loses definition. It weaves into the light, lives in the light, is one with the light. But the moment our thinking is received into the light, it is no longer possible to have an ego that as easily as one has between birth and death. Our body is organized in such a way that our being reflects itself through this body, and we call this mirror image of our ego. It is a faithful mirror image of the real ego that we have, but it is a mirror image, a picture only, a picture thought, a thought picture. The moment the threshold is crossed, this lower ego streams out into the light. For us to look out into our world, there must be the light of the sun or some other light shedding its rays upon the objects of our environment. This light, which is outside, enables us to perceive the external objects. We gain our consciousness of our inner being. Then we feel an inner light, the existence of light which sheds its rays upon our own inner being in the same way in which external rays ordinarily illumine the objects of our environment. This is pure thinking, and it flows forth from a primal source of its own in our human souls, a thinking full of light and clarity. Indeed, the spiritual light that permeates the physical light is the same kind in being as the invisible light that dwells in the human astral body. So, we've often seen this chart, many of us, that shows how when the light ether goes down, which it can, penetrates into the physical plane and continues, it becomes electricity. We've also heard that this light ether that existed as far back as old sun and through the course of evolution has remained either in the physical plane or remained even into this sub-physical. I cannot call this fallen because there's nothing that the light has done to say it fell. So what we have to say is that the light, for our purposes, has penetrated into the physical and on into the sub-physical. And we will find this to be extremely helpful upon our next planetary condition that you've heard me call the Jupiter phase. So we've heard we cannot see any particle smaller than the wavelength of the light used to see it. Since the wavelength of visible light is 10,000 times larger than the typical distance between two atoms, we cannot see individual atoms. Thus, we do not see anything smaller than a molecule. But we can examine atomic surfaces with beams of electrons rather than light. Scanning tunneling microscopes generate electron waves that can interact with atoms, and special microscopes then measure that interaction to render these types of images that you see here. Okay, so as we scale down from molecules to atoms to subatomic particles, physicists offer this roadmap for the subatomic realm. And you can see names like quarks and leptons and bosons, and the photons, the so-called light particle. And the concept of electricity has to do with the movement of these electrons. But as we saw earlier, when we ask the question, do electrons and photons have mass? We can give electrons that, but we cannot do that with photons. But then we have to ask the question, what is mass? And we find mass in Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. So what is mass? And that leads us to the question, what is matter? Matter that has mass. Is matter darkness? Does darkness radiate? Is that what gravity is? So I can't go into all of those sort of questions today, but it's fascinating that this brings up the theory that's called string theory. And what they look at is as if you took a string and you vibrate it, that since light is waves, this seems to fit, but then can we say that particles are also waves? Are they vibrations? Are they standing waves? And I also mentioned something earlier that Robert Grosseteste brought up when I read the Steiner quote, "Let us look at the boundary between the physical and etheric substance." And we ask, what lies between the physical and etheric substances? Is it, and Steiner says, it is nothing like anything else in the world. It's not gold nor silver. It is something that cannot be compared with anything other than physical substance, yet it is the essence of all of them. It is a substance that is contained in every other physical substance, so that other physical substances can be considered to be modifications of this one substance. And he goes on to say the Rosicrucians found this, and that they found it through the power given to them by their moral deeds, by what they were able to do inwardly, morally. So we have heard that plants use sunlight to manufacture certain molecules. Is this an indicator that creative beings use the living light as it penetrates the physical to organize matter? And we've seen this diagram about thinking in light, and we have to ask, is the sunlight the thinking of these spiritual beings? And does this sunlight affect subatomic particles with some emergent principles? Rudolf Steiner tells us that even as ice is condensed water, so matter is condensed spirit. Mineral, plant, animal, or man, each of us, all of us are a condensed form of the spirit. Matter is the outer side of will. As we perceive from outside, will is matter, and thought is outwardly light. And within, matter is will and light is thought. The essential thing for us today is that the world, including man, is an interpenetration of thought light, and that I lost my place here, and that the concrete element is built up of the most various ways from the permeation of the content of thought light, light thought, into matter will and will matter. So I mentioned earlier scientists, and David Bohm is the most well-known for this, talking about matter as frozen light. And I put a link here that you can see. There's others work going on by scientists that say the universe and brain are linked in a quantum basis, and other sorts of fascinating things going on today. In 1921, Steiner said, we used to think of matter as composed of atoms. Now science would have us think of electrons moving through space and having properties like those we formerly attributed to matter. Remember, this was about the time that the proton was discovered, but we don't discover the neutron until the 1930s. In fact, our scientists have taken the first step, only they do not yet admit it, towards the overcoming of matter. So in this keynote, I've tried to show how close quantum mechanics has come to spiritual science. It was by observing the collapse of the wave function that raised questions such as, has science encountered consciousness? Way back in 1995, David Chalmers called consciousness the hard problem. And ever since it has been, especially for materialistic science. So are we on our way to a sort of post-materialism sciences? As you know, Rudolf Steiner called thinking a spiritual activity. In his book, The Philosophy of Freedom, Rudolf Steiner gave us the key to get a handle on this hard problem. We saw that light came into existence during Old Sun as a response of those who were on the human stage back then, the archangels of today. What is sunlight? It is the garment of spiritual beings. Our own thoughts are illuminated for us through the fact that we breathe in this sunlight. When we study laser light, we are no longer studying the fullness of light as in sunlight. Laser light no longer carries life, for example. Etheric light can, through its interactions, become physical light. It can go further into subphysical, where it exists as electricity. Alas, we currently have no means to measure or test the non-material etheric or its ethers, including light. We also found that many scientists are wondering if matter is light, yet in another state. Lastly, we need to ask, what is energy? Is this the bridge to spiritual science? Is energy, in fact, a spiritual force? We also question, what is mass? Our question about c, the speed of light, I'll address in my Saturday talk. Much I would love to have covered, but time and energy would not permit. Such topics as entanglement, gravity, darkness and color, rainbows and halos, and antimatter. It will be exciting as topics like these might be covered by some of our speakers in the coming days. So thank you, and I wish you, thank you. I wish in our journey together, each of you has an enriching experience, but most of all, I hope this conference can serve as a catalyst for moving the boundaries of natural science into the field of spiritual science. Now let's explore together the mysteries of light.